You spent $2,000 on freeze-dried stroganoff and bulk pinto beans. You stack them in your garage like a monument to your own survival genius. You step back, wipe the sweat from your brow, and tell yourself you are ready for the collapse. Congratulations, you just played yourself. You are not ready for the apocalypse. You were just running a very expensive, very inefficient buffet for aerobic bacteria and pantry moths. It is honestly hilarious how many people drop a small fortune on emergency calories only to murder their own food supply with a $10 oversight. They think survival is about the initial purchase. They think buying the supplies makes them invincible, but they are completely blind to the silent physics operating inside those containers.
They will be the first ones starving in the dark, staring at a bucket of rancid grain, wondering why the universe betrayed them. Survival failure rarely comes from a dramatic shootout with marauders. It comes from the microscopic, ignored details that quietly rot your safety net from the inside out. Before I dismantle your false sense of security and show you the exact $10 mistake currently destroying your pantry, take a second to appease the machine. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Consider it a digital smoke signal to let the algorithm know you are still alive, still paying attention, and trying not to become a cautionary tale for the next generation. Let us begin with mistake number 1, the hardware store bucket illusion. The trap is so common, it is practically a rite of passage for amateurs. They drive to a big box store, buy a stack of bright orange or blue 5-gallon utility buckets, dump 50 pounds of white rice directly into the plastic, and hammer the lid shut. They write the date on the side with a permanent marker and feel like absolute survival gods. This is exactly what they do, and this is exactly why they will fail. They assume that because a bucket holds paint or drywall mud, it is a fortress against the elements. They trust the plastic. They trust the cheap rubber gasket. That trust is a fatal error in basic chemistry. Here is the ugly truth about your plastic fortress. High-density polyethylene, the material those cheap buckets are made of, is incredibly porous at a microscopic level. It is not an absolute barrier to gas exchange. While you are sleeping comfortably, oxygen molecules are slowly, relentlessly migrating through the walls of that plastic container. But the real betrayal comes from the lid. Standard utility bucket lids are not engineered for long-term hermetic sealing. They are designed to keep liquid from splashing out in the back of a pickup truck, not to halt atmospheric degradation over 5 years. Every time the temperature in your storage area changes, the air inside that bucket expands and contracts. This thermal cycling turns your bucket into a slow-motion lung. It exhales during the heat of the day and inhales deeply when the temperature drops at night. And what exactly is it inhaling? Fresh, damp, oxygen-rich air from your poorly insulated garage. This brings us to the actual science of why your food is dying. When you trap raw commodities in an unsealed environment with fluctuating temperatures, you are inviting 2 relentless destroyers into your home. The first is oxidation. You might think white rice and dry beans last forever, but they still contain trace amounts of lipids, otherwise known as fats. When oxygen comes into contact with these fats, a chemical reaction occurs, breaking down the lipid molecules and creating free radicals. This process is called lipid oxidation, and it is the exact mechanism that causes food to go rancid. It destroys the nutritional profile, degrades the vitamins, and creates a taste so incredibly foul that even a starving person will vomit it back up. They will open their buckets expecting sustenance and find a toxic, foul-smelling sludge. The second destroyer is moisture condensation. Remember the slow-motion lung effect? When your uninsulated garage drops 20 degrees overnight, the moisture trapped in that inhaled air hits the cold inside wall of your plastic bucket and condenses into liquid water. It is a tiny amount, maybe just a few drops at first, but day after day, week after week, those drops accumulate. They drip down into the top layer of your grain. Water is the absolute spark of life, and in food storage, life means death. The moment the moisture content of your grain pushes past 12%, you have created a utopian paradise for mold spores and mycotoxins. These are not things you can just cook out with boiling water. Mycotoxins are brutal, heat-stable chemical compounds produced by fungi that will destroy your liver and shut down your immune system. They will literally poison you with the very food you bought to save your life.
The fix is brilliantly simple, yet they ignore it because they want to cut corners. They think they can save $10 by skipping the internal barrier. The brutal solution to mistake number 1 is realizing that the bucket is just structural armor. It is not the environmental seal. The actual seal must be a metallized barrier, specifically a heavy-duty mylar bag paired with correctly sized oxygen absorbers. A mylar bag is a continuous film of aluminum layered with polyester. It is completely impermeable to gas exchange. When you place your food inside the mylar, drop in the oxygen absorbers, and heat seal the top, you create a legitimate static vacuum. You eliminate the oxygen, you halt the lipid oxidation, and you stop the thermal lung effect dead in its tracks. The bucket is just there to stop rodents from chewing through the foil. Failing to spend that extra $10 on proper mylar and absorbers means you just threw away 6 months of food to save the price of a cheap lunch. But the bucket illusion is only the beginning. The next failure point is even more pathetic, and it has to do with where you actually put those buckets. Mistake number 2 is the geographical tragedy of the American garage. They take their newly sealed buckets, pat themselves on the back, and stack them right against the south-facing exterior wall, or, even worse, hoist them up into the rafters to save floor space. They think they are being incredibly efficient. They look at the neat columns of plastic and see a perfectly organized apocalypse pantry. What they have actually built is a slow cooker for their emergency rations. They treat thermodynamics like a myth, assuming that as long as the food is indoors, it is safe. This is pure, unadulterated ignorance of basic physics. The science here is completely unforgiving. Let me introduce you to the Arrhenius Equation, a principle of physical chemistry that dictates the rate of chemical reactions. In the context of food storage, it translates to a brutal reality. For every 10 degrees Celsius the temperature rises, the rate of chemical degradation doubles. That means the nutritional breakdown, the color loss, and the texture degradation happen twice as fast. When they stack their food near the ceiling of an uninsulated garage, they are placing it in a microclimate that regularly reaches 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the summer. The heat trapped in those rafters is literally cooking the nutrients out of the grain. A 30-year shelf life for wheat berries drops to barely 3 years when stored in a perpetual heat wave. They are rapidly accelerating the entropy of their own survival. The fix here requires suppressing the urge to use vertical space like a warehouse manager. The brutal solution to mistake number 2 involves spending $10 on a basic digital thermometer with a humidity sensor, also known as a hygrometer. You place one at floor level and one near the ceiling of your storage area. When you see the massive temperature differential, you will understand why food must be stored low and away from exterior walls. You need a stable, cool microclimate. The interior closets of a house, underneath stairwells, or a dedicated basement corner are the only acceptable locations. You must treat your food storage like a root cellar, not an overflow storage unit for holiday decorations. But even if they manage to find a cool room, they immediately sprint headfirst into mistake number 3, the concrete death trap. The label for this failure could simply be called thermal bridging, but we will call it what it is, which is sheer laziness. They drag their heavy buckets into the basement or the designated cool room and drop them directly onto the bare concrete floor. They think the concrete is solid, dry, and safe. They assume because the floor feels dry to the touch, it is inert. They are trusting their hands instead of material science. The concrete slab under your house is essentially a massive, rigid sponge sitting directly on top of damp earth. It is constantly wicking moisture upward through capillary action. Furthermore, concrete is a phenomenal thermal conductor. When a plastic bucket sits directly on cold concrete while the ambient air in the room is warmer, it creates a localized temperature differential at the base of the bucket. This is where physics turns against them once again. Even if they used mylar, the air trapped inside the bucket but outside the mylar bag will experience condensation. Over time, that moisture accumulates at the bottom, creating a damp, dark environment perfectly suited for mold to attack the exterior of the bags or degrade the structural integrity of the bucket itself. But the bigger issue is the microscopic moisture transfer. If they skipped the internal foil barrier, as we discussed in the first mistake, that concrete floor is actively pumping moisture right through the bottom of the porous plastic bucket. The fix for the concrete death trap is embarrassing in its simplicity. You do not need a degree in structural engineering to elevate your food. The $10 adjustment is to go to a local hardware store and buy a few pieces of scrap lumber, or better yet, grab a free wooden pallet from behind a grocery store. Put a physical, insulating barrier between your food and the concrete slab. A layer of rigid foam board insulation or a wooden platform breaks the thermal bridge and stops the capillary action of moisture. It lifts the plastic out of the danger zone and allows air to circulate underneath. If your survival food is touching the bare floor, you are actively participating in its destruction. These failures are all interconnected. They buy the wrong container, they store it in a high-heat environment, and they let it suck moisture out of the concrete. It is a symphony of errors, all compounding upon each other, turning thousands of dollars of life-saving calories into absolute garbage. And the worst part is, they have no idea it is happening. They will not discover the rot until the grocery stores are empty, and they crack open that first bucket, expecting salvation, but finding only despair. But we are not done yet. There is one more critical failure point, a psychological trap regarding the contents of those buckets that almost everyone falls into. Mistake number 4, the Trojan horse of the prepper pantry. They assume because the grain looks clean at the grocery store, it is sterile. They pour hundreds of pounds of flour, rice, and pasta into their buckets, seal them up with a false sense of security, and walk away. They have just built a 5-gallon maternity ward for insects. They think they are storing food for their family, but they are actually hoarding it for a thriving, microscopic colony of granary weevils and Indian meal moths. This is the part of survival storage that makes amateurs incredibly uncomfortable, but we do not have the luxury of ignoring biology. The science here is basic agricultural entomology. Almost all bulk grains and flours contain microscopic insect eggs. It is an unavoidable reality of the global agricultural supply chain. You cannot wash them out, and you cannot sift them out. When they dump that raw grain into a bucket and place it in a moderately warm room, they are providing the exact incubation parameters those dormant eggs need to hatch. The larvae emerge, gorge themselves on the carbohydrates, pupate, and reproduce. Because the bucket is sealed, the insects cannot escape, but they do not need to. They will consume the grain, excrete waste, and multiply until the food source is a dusty, web-filled, foul-smelling husk. And here is the truly horrific part of the physics involved. As those insects breathe and metabolize the grain, they excrete water vapor. Their respiration actually increases the internal humidity of the bucket, which triggers the catastrophic biological feedback loop of mold and mycotoxins we discussed in the first mistake. By the time they open the bucket 2 years later, it will look like the surface of a moving, crawling alien planet. The brutal solution to mistake number 4 is realizing you must kill the enemy before you lock the gates. There is a $10 adjustment here, and it involves atmospheric manipulation. You must deploy the oxygen absorbers we talked about, but you must do it without falling into the trap within the trap. This is where almost everyone completely ruins their own strategy. They buy a bulk pack of oxygen absorbers, rip open the vacuum-sealed master bag, and leave the packets sitting on the kitchen counter for an hour while they slowly, lazily scoop rice into their buckets. They are completely oblivious to the exothermic reaction happening right in front of them. Oxygen absorbers are essentially packets of fine iron powder, salt, and clay. The moment they are exposed to the atmosphere, the iron begins to rust, pulling oxygen out of the air to fuel the chemical oxidation process. If they leave that packet on the counter for 60 minutes, it absorbs the ambient room oxygen and becomes totally inert. It turns into a useless, microscopic brick of rust. You can actually feel it. If the packet feels hard and crunchy like a rock, the iron has fully oxidized and the packet is dead. If it feels soft and powdery, it is still active. When they finally drop a dead absorber into their bucket, it does absolutely nothing. The weevil eggs survive, hatch, and thrive, completely unbothered by the useless little packet sitting on top of them. The fix is treating your oxygen absorbers like volatile tactical equipment. You open the master bag, extract exactly what you need for the immediate containers you are sealing, and instantly seal the remaining absorbers in a small glass mason jar. A mason jar costs about $2, making this the cheapest insurance policy on Earth. You must work with ruthless, calculated efficiency. Drop the active, powdery absorber into the Mylar bag and seal it with a hot iron within 60 seconds. When the oxygen concentration inside that Mylar bag drops below 0.1%, adult insects suffocate immediately, and the microscopic eggs remain dormant forever. You win through superior chemical warfare, not through blind hope. But let us assume they actually managed to get the Mylar right, they manage the temperature, they block the concrete, and they successfully suffocate the weevils. They still fall victim to mistake number 5, the fantasy of infinite preservation. This is the psychological trap. They look at the 30-year shelf life stamp on a commercially packed bucket of freeze-dried food and treat it like a magical spell. They shove it in the dark corner of the basement and never look at it again. They think survival is a static event. Survival is an active, ongoing audit. They ignore the reality of microscopic pinholes, failed factory seals, or unnoticed rodent damage. Entropy never stops working, not even for a 30-year warranty. The ambient humidity of their environment is constantly looking for a weakness in the armor. A tiny scratch on the side of a bag or a slightly defective heat seal is all it takes for the atmosphere to breach the perimeter. The final $10 adjustment to fix this mistake is simple inventory management driven by data. You do not just store food, you audit it. You go online and buy a highly accurate digital luggage scale for exactly $10. When you first seal a bucket or buy a commercial supply, you weigh it down to the exact ounce. You take a thick, permanent marker and write that starting weight in massive numbers right on the front of the plastic, along with the date. Once every 6 months, you walk into your storage room, hook the digital scale to the handle, and lift. If a bucket of freeze-dried food suddenly weighs 3 ounces more than it did last year, it has been compromised. It is absorbing atmospheric moisture through a microscopic breach you cannot even see. You must detect the failure before the failure becomes fatal. If the weight changes, you open it, consume it immediately, and replace it. They rely on guesswork and marketing slogans. You must rely on physics and mathematics. But let us pretend for a moment that you actually listened. Let us pretend you bought the Mylar, elevated the buckets, and suffocated the insects. You are still not safe, because the amateur mind is infinitely creative when it comes to self-sabotage. This brings us to mistake number 6, the aesthetic delusion. They have a bizarre psychological need to display their preparations like a museum exhibit. They ditch the heavy plastic utility buckets entirely and transfer their bulk dry goods into beautiful, crystal-clear glass jars or transparent polycarbonate bins. They line them up perfectly on open steel shelving units right in the middle of a brightly lit room. They take pictures of the setup. They show it off to their neighbors. They are treating a survival redoubt like a trendy coffee shop. What they have actually constructed is a slow-motion radiation chamber. They think that because the glass is thick and the lid is tight, the food is perfectly isolated from the universe. Once again, they have completely ignored the laws of physics operating right in front of their eyes. Let us talk about photodegradation. Light is not just illumination. Light is a continuous stream of electromagnetic radiation. Every single photon of light streaming through your basement window, or even radiating from the LED bulbs in your ceiling, carries kinetic energy. When those photons strike the surface of your stored food through a clear container, they transfer that energy directly into the cellular structure of the grain. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the brutal reality of photochemistry. That radiant energy actively breaks down the complex organic molecules that keep your biological engine running. It destroys riboflavin, it annihilates vitamin A, and it drastically accelerates the exact same lipid oxidation we discussed earlier. They will look at a glass jar of pinto beans 3 years from now and marvel at how beautifully pale and white they have become, completely unaware that the color loss is visual proof of catastrophic nutritional death. They will be eating ghost calories. The food will look like beans, it will feel like beans, but it will have the nutritional profile of wet cardboard. When they try to survive on those ghost calories, their stomachs will feel full, but their bodies will literally begin cannibalizing their own muscle tissue for lack of actual vitamins and intact amino acids. They will slowly starve to death while actively chewing their pristine, light-bleached rice. The brutal solution here is to embrace the darkness. The aesthetic of real survival is incredibly ugly, and you need to get comfortable with that immediately. Your storage area should look like a fortified tomb, not a lifestyle magazine. If you insist on using clear containers for immediate pantry access, The $10 fix is buying a can of opaque, matte black spray paint and completely blacking out the exterior of the glass. If your shelving unit is exposed to ambient room light, you spend that $10 on heavy industrial blackout curtains and drape them over the entire rack, securing them tightly at the sides. True long-term preservation requires absolute sensory deprivation. The food must be sealed away from oxygen, sealed away from heat, insulated from the concrete, and completely plunged into eternal darkness. If you can see the food is actively dying. When you step back and look at all of these failures, a terrifying pattern emerges. The bucket illusion, the concrete death trap, the insect maternity ward, and the aesthetic delusion all stem from the exact same fatal flaw. They treat survival as a one-time financial transaction. They think they can buy independence with a credit card at a big box store and then completely wash their hands of the responsibility. They want the dopamine hit of making a massive purchase without the relentless, grinding discipline of actual maintenance. They are fundamentally dependent people trying to purchase an independent lifestyle. It is a psychological paradox, and it is exactly why they will fail when the system collapses. True independence is not a shopping list. True independence is a hostile, exhausting audit of your own environment. It requires you to look at a concrete floor and see a thermal bridge. It requires you to look at a clear jar and see a radiation leak. It requires you to look at a cheap plastic lid and recognize it as a porous, breathing membrane. You must accept the fundamental premise that the universe is actively trying to break down, consume, and rot every single thing you try to save. Entropy is the only constant in nature. The moment you stop fighting that entropy with applied science, you have already lost the war. They will starve because they trusted a cheap piece of plastic to hold back the laws of thermodynamics. They will watch their families suffer because they were too lazy to spend $10 on a piece of scrap wood, a mylar barrier, or a blackout curtain. So here's my final challenge to you. The next time you walk past your so-called survival pantry, do not pat yourself on the back. Do not look at those neatly stacked buckets with a sense of unearned pride. I want you to look at them with absolute, clinical suspicion. Assume they are failing right now. Assume the moisture is creeping in through the floor. Assume the weevils are hatching in the warmth. Tear open a bucket. Weigh the contents with your digital scale. Check the pliability of the oxygen absorbers, and mathematically prove to yourself that your science is sound. Because when the supply chain finally fractures, and the grocery store shelves are stripped bare by the panicked masses in a matter of hours, there will be no customer service hotline to call for a refund. There will be no government agency coming to save you from your own arrogant oversight. You will be left completely alone in the dark, standing over a bucket of toxic, rotting grain, realizing you sacrificed your entire future because you wanted to save $10. Good luck.